So, good morning, dear colleagues and friends. On behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I would like to welcome you to the presentation of the study titled A New Agenda for the Mediterranean: Are the European Union Tools and Means of Action Up to its Ambitions? It's a very ambitious title. The study was requested by the AFET Committee and commissioned by the Policy Department of External Policies, today here represented. It was written between January and April this year, and the study has been made to members end of May and published on the Parliament website. You will also find physical copies here in the room. The study has been produced by a team led by two main authors who I just met, and I'm happy to do so. Two experts that I would like to welcome here in this room: Katarzyna Sidlo from the Center for Social and Economic Research, CASE, in Warsaw, Poland, where she is the Director of Middle East and North Africa Department, and Emmanuel Cohen-Hadria from the European Institute of the Mediterranean in Girona, Spain, where he is Director of the Euro-Mediterranean Policies Department. Technical remarks, as always, before we start. This meeting is taking place in a physical presence only. The interested public can follow the meeting in web streaming on the EP Live. Our meeting will take place in English with French also interpretation available. Should members wish to speak in the Q&A following the presentation, please make your request known to me or the always very helpful Secretariat that is here today. With these preliminary remarks, we can begin addressing the substance. First, allow me to give a little bit of background on the AFET request for this study. When the joint communication was published, it was in February 2021. It was presented in the committee by Commissioner Bargeli Oliver as an initiative to rebuild EU's relation with the Southern Neighbourhood in North Africa and the Middle East, based on as equal partnership around common interests. Very important, this equal partnership. And common challenges such as economy, trade, rule of law, human rights, health, green, digital transition, migration, and last but not least, peace and security. The main innovation of the communication is contained in the economic and investment plan for the region, relying on not just the traditional EU grants, but also on leveraging funds from public and private entities using EU loans and budgetary guarantees. However, committee members have also asked Commissioner Bargeli pertinent questions on whether the new agenda can deliver on the stated goals and whether it is fit for purpose within the current political socio-economic situation in the region and, of course, for the current state of the EU-Mediterranean relations. Therefore, we have asked the researchers to critically but constructively analyze the subject matter, both the overall relations from a historical and all-encompassing perspective, as well as the feasibility of the investment flagships of the new agenda. I am glad to note that the study indeed comes up with relevant recommendations from the EU and Parliament, both for the EU institutions also and the Parliament, on how to positively contribute to boosting the Southern Neighbourhood policy. I would like to add that the draft study was also made available to shadow rapporteurs and members who are responsible for the relevant AFET recommendation on the Southern Neighbourhood. Technical meetings are ongoing on that. I think we had one on our teams on Monday. They tell me that went more or less well. We'll see. And next week, we will have our first political shadows meeting. So also in that sense, I think it's a very good timing to talk today about this study. Furthermore, also today's presentation also fits well into other committees' work, such as the geopolitical dialogues on the funding for the region that took place this Monday with Vice President of the Commission and High Representative for the EU Foreign and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, and Commissioner for Enlargement and Neighbourhood Policies, Varhelyi Oliver. We also held a debate in AFET with the European Committee for the Regions on the role of the regions in the EU strategy for the Mediterranean just yesterday. And finally, on a very final note, I would like to hear from the authors, that's what we came here for, on how they assess the consequences of the Russian invasion also, as one of the main points in Ukraine, on the EU relations with the southern neighborhoods, energy, food crisis, so many things that are going on. I will give them the floor now to the speakers, 15 minutes. I'm from Spain. We can play a little bit with that. Not too much, but which you can divide between you as you fit good. I will give now the floor first to Katarzyna Sidlo, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to present the findings of the study that we prepared together with Emmanuel and some of the other authors. And at first, I would actually like to take this opportunity to thank all the colleagues who contributed to the study, including our senior experts, our quality control, and our interns and research assistants. They're not here with us today, but were of a lot of help while working on the study. I would also really like to thank all 62 stakeholders that we interviewed for the study that were very gracious with their time and thoughts and feedback, which really helped us to prepare the report. Because we only have 15 minutes more or less, we will not be able to present all the recommendations, let alone all the findings that we have. So what we will do is we'll go through some of the most important and, in our opinion, most interesting points. And we'll also make some suggestions as we go to the things that we believe could be elaborated on later on during the Q&A, if there's any interest, of course. So first, Emmanuel will talk through a little bit about the state of the Euro-Mediterranean relations. Next, I will be presenting some of the key aspects of the new agenda, and then we'll both go through some of the key recommendations. So, Emmanuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katarzyna, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I'd like to join you, Katarzyna, actually in your thanks, in particular to the AFET committee, to the policy departments, to the people that are in the room or behind the screens. Without any delay, I'd like to start indeed with the presentation of a general assessment of Euro-Mediterranean relations in 4-5 minutes. And starting with our assessment that the Euro-Mediterranean partnership has lost quite some traction over the last years. If you go to southern neighbors of the European Union, you find that they seem to be less interested. They would routinely denounce EU interference, asymmetrical relations. They would question the benefits of the cooperation. They diversify their alliances. They have also been more assertive and more transactional in the relationship with the European Union. To what extent what is being described here is also related to what's happening within the European Union, with a more introspective European Union, populism on the rise, an overwhelming focus on migration, to the detriment of other aspects of the partnership. All of this, of course, having a cost in terms of credibility, in terms of attractiveness, and in terms of how the EU is perceived in the region. And I think that's quite an important point of our study. So all in all, both parts of the Mediterranean seem to be less committed to, less interested in one another. You will maybe ask me what are your indicators? How do you measure this? Just to name 3 of them. Take, for example, the consistent refusal to engage, open or conclude negotiations on these flagship frameworks that the EU has been very much attached to over the last years, DCFTAs, readmission agreements. So that's one indicator. Another one, maybe more symbolic, would be the fact that repeated attempts over the last years to upgrade the bilateral relationship of the European Union with some of its partners to change the labels of this cooperation that have proved to be in vain, and I can elaborate if you want later on in the Q&As. And then the last maybe indicator would be the turnout in major Euro-Mediterranean meetings. I think there was a pattern in 21 of, for example, Maghrebi representatives not attending at the expected level, UFM foreign ministers meeting, for example, or even plenary sessions of the Parliamentary Assembly of the UFM. Now, if you move from IEMed relations to EU foreign policy towards the region in particular, of course, there are a lot of things being done. Of course, there is a lot of dedication from people in delegations in Brussels. But if you take the very ambitious benchmark of stabilizing and transforming EU's neighborhoods, what do you find? Well, transformation, the case of Tunisia is not precisely a success story in terms of transformation, despite all the political, financial capital that the EU has invested in Tunisia. EU support has not been decisive enough to incentivize reforms and to prevent the country from worsening. Stabilization, the case of Syria, Libya, the Middle East peace process, all show that the EU has not been able to impose itself as a decisive and as a united security provider. So that's the picture. Interestingly, and to relate to what the chair invited us to do as well, the response to the war in Ukraine has only further illustrated the shaky health of the IEMed relations. And I'm not talking only about official reactions of governments, of countries that have, as we know, remained rather neutral. I'm also talking about public opinions. I'm also talking about narratives in media, in social media. Again, we can maybe elaborate later on, but that have been quite hostile to the European Union sometimes, confirming this problem of perceptions. So with this, I will close with this very introductory assessment, and back to you, Katarzyna. Thank you for your attention.
Right, thank you, Emmanuel. So what I will move to is discussing two of what we think are some of the key aspects of the new agenda. And the first one I want to focus on is the financial dimension. So the EU presented what we think is a refreshed financial approach towards the Southern Neighbourhood. And we summarized those changes that were made as moves towards consolidation, simplification, increased flexibility, geographization, and a policy-first principle. So, for instance, when you think about the increased flexibility, the funds under the FSD Plus were not pre-allocated. So here our understanding is that there's a certain element of competition that will take place for the funds. There are two windows. Within the first window, which constitutes the sole mandate of the EIB, that is sovereign and non-commercial sub-sovereign funding. So here the national governments will, in the partner countries, they will be applying for the funds. Under the second window, which is the open architecture, and here a change was made because not just EIB, but other operators can apply for this one as well. So here financial institutions will be applying for funding under open calls. So the advantage of this approach is more flexibility. But then again, it does raise the question of the capacity of individual countries actually to be able to make the most of the opportunities that are available. What we also argue in the report is that there's a new weight that is given to investment and financial instruments, and that this new weight comes as a response to a sense of disillusion with the impact of those more classical instruments that have been used so far, and with rather mixed results that those classical instruments have generated over the last decade when it comes to the transformative power. Moreover, some changes were introduced to the rather controversial issue of conditionality. So under the new programming, cooperation, migration, and economic governance and reform have been added to the previously existing list of criteria that determine allocation of the funds. And those, just to put it in a nutshell, they do raise a little bit of a question regarding how important or how much importance will be given to the issue of human rights, support to the rule of law and democracy. In particular, since the Southern Neighbourhood partner countries, as Emmanuel already mentioned, are increasingly reluctant to accept any form of interference from the EU, but also because of other powers in the region are, let's call it, more realistic in their approach. They do not condition their assistance on human rights or democracy-related issues, although naturally there are always some kind of strings attached to their assistance. Now, moving on from financial aid to the social dimension of the new agenda, what we find is that the joint communication pays a greater attention than the previous ENP strategic documents, inclusive growth, and to new inclusive economic models that go beyond traditionally understood economic efficiency, and that take into consideration social and environmental aspects as well. So what the new agenda mentions is support for the green, for the blue, and for the social economy. And we actually find that it's particularly worth highlighting this new focus on social economy in particular. But under more traditional headlines, there are issues such as social protection, still huge size of the informal economy, high spending on general subsidies that have been exceeding this of the social safety nets, high unemployment rates, and low labour market participation rates among the women in the region. And given how protracted all those problems are, there's definitely a need to move beyond what is rather general level statements that were listed under the EAP and move towards more tangible and actionable solutions. So in particular, we believe that here technical assistance is of crucial importance to assist governments in designing more resilient and more tailor-made approaches for social protection schemes. I don't have time to go through more details, but I think some of the points that are also of particular importance when it comes to the new agenda is the process that actually led to creation of the new agenda, as well as digital and green, which are two very strong policy focuses on top of the kind of more strategic communication and communication in general that Emmanuel already mentioned.
Should we move to the recommendations?
Yes, please.
Good. So maybe let me start with three quite general recommendations that we came up with. The first one will be increasing efforts on strategic communication. We call it shaping the optics. You may know that efforts are, of course, already being made on that front, in particular in terms of the fight against disinformation, with a very active, for example, EU regional media officer based in Beirut, the Task Force South Stratcom unit from the ES. But if the EU wants to be in tune with what other powers do in the region in terms of strategic communication, more human, more financial resources are needed. And here I'm not only talking about countering disinformation. I'm talking about more proactive work on coming up with tailored messages to specific audiences in Arabic language, if we're talking about Arabic countries in these countries. And that requires indeed a more specific efforts to understand how the EU is perceived in these countries. And again, the war in Ukraine can only encourage the EU to go in that direction. It's also about the EU being more united in its communication. The communication is still too scattered between Brussels and between member states, sometimes even between the EU institutions themselves that are not pushing in the same direction. It is also about better capitalizing on what the European Union does. So that's strategic communication. And then the second recommendation would derive quite naturally from our assessments that the peace and security chapter of the joint communication is rather weak. I'm convinced that the focus on socio-economic development, on inclusiveness is the right one, but I think it's also a missed opportunity to articulate a more strategic engagement of the EU in its southern neighbourhoods. I think this should be done. The European Parliament could maybe initiate the debate on, the EU's action in the region, the more strategic one, how the region fits with broader debates, for example, on strategic autonomy. because, you know, the Southern Neighbourhood should be seen and is possibly possible partners to reduce the EU's vulnerability and dependency to other powers. But sometimes it should also be acknowledged that it is a source itself of possible dependency. I'm thinking of migration, for example. Migration blackmail is unacceptable. These are the words of the HRVP. The EU should definitely be more united and more firm when dealing with this blackmail. More firm, but also more creative and more ambitious to assume its role as a security provider. I don't think by being more active, the EU would renounce to its commitments to multilateralism, but I think the EU definitely has the cards to play, for example, with trying to play with the benefits of the normalization process and steering the normalization process between Israel and some countries of the region in the way it would want. So that's the second, and then the third recommendation would be moving away from business as usual with the European neighbourhood policy. You will ask me, what does that mean? It means first acknowledging that when some of the frameworks, some of the pillars, DCFTA's readmission agreements do not work, then the EU should more flexibly and rapidly adjust to this. It also means that, you know, if there is a rift between a methodology that has proven successful in the Eastern Partnership, because there DCFTA readmission agreements that works, and the Southern Neighbourhood with stalling relations, then that possibly calls for a serious discussion on whether a single umbrella for East and South Neighbourhood under the ENP is really necessary and still serves a purpose. And as part of this discussion, a summit at the heads of states and government level could be convened. This is something that is foreseen by the joint communication that has also some provisions on political dialogue. Such a summit could maybe be convened under the Spanish presidency, for example, in 2023. That's it for the first three.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And I will very quickly finish with three other recommendations that we think are also important enough to mention them here. The first one that I want to stress really is the need to prioritize improvement of the business climate in the region. So there will be no or hardly any nearshoring or reshoring whatsoever of the EU production to the Southern Neighbourhood unless the environment to conduct business is improved in the region. And what we mean here is predictable legislation, efficient judiciary, trustworthy judiciary, less red tape. Improving business climate will help with investment flows. It will help to leverage those funds that are expected to be mobilized on top of the money that's already allocated under the Energy Global Europe. The EU, under joint communication, is planning good efforts towards mitigation of investment risks. So we have credit guarantees and increased support from financial institutions. But what we think is really important to stress is that expectations should be managed. Regarding how effective those measures can be, again, without effort on part of the Southern Neighbourhood countries when it comes to the improvement of this business climate, reforms on good governance and the rule of law. Secondly, on the clean energy, and this one is really important also, it gained even more importance with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the related energy crisis. And here we have four kind of bullet point recommendations. And the first one is to limit the current adaptation financing gap. So what really is needed is to evaluate whether the funds that are assigned for climate-related actions are sufficient both to tackle the challenges, but also to compensate the Southern Neighbourhood countries for potential losses and for disadvantages. And this is really also important because environmental actions are really not very high on the priority list as it is among the policymakers in the region. The second point is that incentives need to be introduced in order to phase out subsidies for fossil fuels across the region. Third one, and this is in a win-win spirit, there should be merging of environmental protection goals of the EU and the investment needs of the Southern Neighbourhood. So the partnership can be built around commitment from the EU to invest in the renewable energy, which will, and clean hydrogen. And this would both help the economies in the Southern Neighbourhood, but it would also help the EU actually to secure energy exports to the EU in the future. And finally, and this is in the light of the food-related crisis that is increasingly visible because of the wheat and fertilizer shortages, which used to be imported both from Ukraine and from Russia. Investment is needed towards more resilient food systems in the Southern Neighbourhood. And in particular, priority should be given to low-carbon fertilizers, which could, for example, be produced using the green ammonia. Now, the final recommendation that we want to close our presentation with pertains directly to the role of the European Parliament in the implementation of the joint communication. So here, the main scope for action is within the parliamentary diplomacy, which can be implemented through work of parliamentary bodies with regional international organizations, but also maintaining direct diplomatic relations with counterparts in the parliaments in the Southern Neighbourhood. And here we think that the Parliamentary Assembly of the Union for the Mediterranean, even when you account for all the issues with the functioning of the UFM itself, as well as varying degrees of power that the parliaments in individual Southern Neighbourhood countries have, we still think that the Parliamentary Assembly of the UFM remains a valuable forum for discussion and exchange of opinions. On top of that, election observation missions remain a key instrument to be maintained. Highlighting the particular case of Tunisia, perhaps to summarize the presentation, in light of the ongoing political changes and socioeconomic changes in the country, we believe it is worth supporting the process of carrying out kind of a structured analysis of the EU engagement in the country so far to understand better what could have been improved, what could went better, just to get some lessons learned for the future. So thank you very much. Those are our very, very brief summary of the report, but we're very happy to answer any questions, go into more detail about anything that we did or did not mention but is in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel and Katarzyna. I have a few questions, but first, you spoke about green economy in your intervention and the approach from the region, and we have some experts in our AFED committee. We have Munir Saturi, maybe he wants to take the floor, but you have Olekas first, who would like to take the floor.
Maybe after you.
No, I keep my...
First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and you explained the different perception in this region after the Russia start war against the Ukraine, different information presented in this document. I would like to ask you a question about the perception and feeling regarding the food supply, particularly the wheat imports. In that page 23, you present the table that quite a lot import is going from Ukraine and from Russia to these countries. We're planning to visit the border of Polish and Ukraine and discuss about this issue. How this perception, not only the political one, but also regarding the food supply and prices on this food. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Indeed, there are some talks regarding the possibility of transporting the food through Poland, and the Polish president actually visited Cairo to that end. But we still don't have any conclusive decisions, since this is a much longer and more expensive route to transport. But regarding the perceptions, what is happening is that what Russia is trying to do is to kind of impose this vision that the shortages are due to the sanctions that were imposed on Russia and not to Russia's actions. So not to blocking of the ports, not due to destruction of the silos, not to blocking of the production. So this is part of this disinformation effort that we already mentioned. And well, we're still not sure how much the internalization of this narrative is prevalent among the Southern Neighbourhood, but definitely it is present when you look into social media, when you look at the traditional media, you can find those narratives. And I think it is really worth later on looking into more in depth to what extent this narrative was more prevalent than the EU narrative. And again, the efforts when it comes to strategic communication of the EU to make sure that this narrative is straightened are really of huge importance.
May I complement? Because before introducing the food issue, you mentioned political perceptions more generally. So let me elaborate a bit on this. The narratives that I mentioned in media and social media were basically, when I said they were hostile to the European Union, it's because you found a lot of Twitter dynamics pointing to the responsibility of the European Union and the West in what's going on in Ukraine. A lot of denouncing double standards of the European Union, as you know, the differential treatment of refugees from Ukraine and from other parts of the world, and a lot of drawing parallels between, for example, the Israeli occupation and the Russian aggression in Ukraine and EU double standards. So very quickly, I'd like to quote a very well-informed observer that is based in Tunisia and that mentioned in a tweet that apart from the westernized US, EU-funded elites, the majority of people I talk to are either pro-Putin or very critical of the US and the EU. So that's just a few things we found. Of course, for the European Union, the difficulties to find a balancing act between making its point very clear while not being perceived, of course, as interfering and respecting the positions of its partners. So it's a very thin line to walk.
Thank you. S'il vous plaît, Mounir.
Président, pour cette étude, il y aurait tant à dire. J'ai envie de...
Thank you, and thank you so much for presenting this study. With regard to what's happening within the European Union, that can change the way countries on the other side of the Mediterranean view the continent. When we talk about the principles of liberty, etc., we're in an open world, and within the EU, within a certain number of states, on women's rights, sexual minorities, attacks on freedoms, attacks on the freedom of the press. When people are looking at this on the other side of the Mediterranean, first country leaders who have understood that what we are most interested in is guarding our borders and limiting migration, and they want increasingly to make us pay a higher price for that. And then in terms of the compromises demanded in terms of respects for human rights and fundamental freedoms, that's a problem. But also in terms of populations, our hypocrisy is being seen, and we're seeing this in public opinion. Neither the populations nor leaders of a certain number of authoritarian regimes, they're raising this. And how do we get out of this tricky problem, this double speak, this hypocrisy? We're hearing louder voices talking about this now. And so we need stability. We need human development to progress. But our problem is that our regional partners, which are less strong, less well equipped than we are in fact much more effective and efficient. And so that's really a question I had, because I think that our lack of clarity is an issue, and we're seeing the consequences of that. Now, when a European Union representative goes to Tunisia, we've seen that the weight in terms of the influence on the population and other leaders costs much more in negative terms than anything else that we might do. And so we need to find much more coherence here. A second point that I wanted to mention is the fact that we've broken things down and we've made a choice to go for bilateralism. Now, I feel that if we want stability in the region, we need that for ourselves, but also for them and between them. And so I would lobby more for partnerships where we are seeing interactions between those countries. Now, we need to work so that the Maghreb Union becomes something that's more concrete, something that starts to work properly, because we have an interest in the stability of the region. And so we want Algeria and Morocco to cooperate, and that they see an interest in cooperating with the EU as well. And so until we're activating all of those economic, financial, political levers in these countries, if we want partnerships with the European Union to have more weight, then we need to encourage countries to cooperate between one another. Then there's an issue of perspective. I think perspective is incredibly important because it's what gives meaning. Your colleague talked about this. It's perspectives and cooperation with renewable energy. Now, I think we need this because there's a lot of wealth in terms of renewable energy, and that doesn't go against our goals. But I feel that we are struggling to achieve carbon neutrality, and we'll struggle to do that without working on our energy mix with those who are close to us. And so how can we do that, with what goals and with what time schedule? Because the energy emergency is becoming more pressing ever since the Ukrainian crisis. And so I would like to know whether that's something that you've looked at. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me start maybe where you started, Monsieur le Député Européen. I could not agree more with what you said at the very beginning. What's going on within the European Union does not remain in the European Union. That's the issue of the perceptions that I mentioned: Islamophobia, populism. Again, this overwhelming focus on migration has a cost that I think the EU underestimates. The EU, I think, underestimates this issue of perceptions. We were told by an interviewee the following sentence: the EU is no longer a moral nor a material reference for southern neighbors. The EU also doesn't see that it is the IEMed relations are no longer exclusive. I think when the Barcelona process was launched, I think when the ENP was launched to some extent as well, the IEMed partnership was an exclusive one to a large extent. It is no longer the case. You also mentioned the elephant in the room, the issue of unity. I'm sorry, it's a recurrent point in whomever studies the EU foreign policy, but that's also a problem in the Southern Neighbourhoods, divisions between EU member states, not only when it comes to crisis, to conflicts, Libya, but also you take Tunisia. For a long time, we thought that Tunisia was an easy file for the European Union, no major divisions between the member states. No big interference from other powers. But when you have a foreign minister of a member state that comes last year without the EU being consulted and going completely off script with the line to take of the European Union, this is not in the interest of the EU. I was in Morocco last week. Still, you hear, I hear colleagues from national embassies having the perception that the EU is perceived as a 28th, that you do have competition between member states instead of having the support to each other, in particular at times when the tensions are increasing between particular member states of the EU and the European Union. This is very sad for whomever is a militant of the reinforcement of foreign policy. So that I think needs to be addressed urgently. Maybe you want to.
If I could add on that, because I also felt called out being from Poland about a certain member states. You're absolutely right. There's a question of legitimacy. There's a question of if you don't have order in your own house, how can you preach outside? And the questions of we did some recommendations about the improvements in terms of the rule of law and good governance in the Southern Neighbourhood. Those first have to be implemented internally into EU member states, and the EU must not kind of be lenient towards certain member states when it comes to those rules if we want to have legitimacy preaching about this in the neighbourhood itself. On the regional integration, this is a very, very difficult topic because the EU has only, there's only that much that the EU can do if there's no political will internally in the countries in the Southern Neighbourhood to work on the integration. And we're talking even on the economic integration itself, when you look on the infrastructure, when you look at the bilateral trade, there's not much going on between the countries in the region for a multitude of reasons. And the EU, of course, should continue to support regional integration, but I feel here the first step really belongs to the countries in the neighbourhood themselves. Finally, on the renewable energy, as I mentioned, I think the key thing is really to look at this kind of win-win partnership. So to make sure that the countries don't lose out because of the Green Deal and because of the policies that the EU is trying to implement, and a deal is made in terms of investments in the clean energy in the neighbourhood, in particular in hydrogen, so that the EU can really secure in the future, in the longer run, imports of the clean energy from the region. In the short run, it's very difficult to secure that. As we've seen, there's a really limited capacity to very quickly kind of increase the exports. Some countries like Egypt are talking about LNG export, but it's also a political issue in the Eastern Mediterranean. So in the short run, there's not that much that can be done, but in the long run, definitely with investment and stress on the win-win partnership, I think this is the way to go for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two things. First, this is a fantastic house. Even a French Green and a Spanish Liberal, we can agree in things. Not absolutely, as you said, but some things, yes. I think that Munir and I, we would agree what the problem, and you agreed what the problem is, but maybe we would differ in the origin or the future, tackle of this. I think that Europe still is a moral, compass, should be. We are losing ground in that, I agree. But in comparison to China or Russia, I don't think we're losing that moral compass. And these are our competitors in the area. So, we might have some problems inside the European Union, but true also, we are fighting for our democratic survival these days. These countries, they have an obsession since a long time ago, to end with this democratic agenda. Because, why? Because we are competitors. Democracy means free trade, free market. And that is very dangerous to these regimes, as well, of course, as our democratic ideals. And this is linked with sometimes some of my colleagues would say some obsession to enthusiast about the Abraham Accords. Maybe where politics is not the answer, this Union for the Mediterranean, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say. Right now, I've been some years as participant in the Parliamentary Assembly. I saw what happened in 2021, at the end of 2021. You cite this in your report, I saw. No good news for the future. This is a political tool. I think that maybe, thinking about the origin of the European Union, maybe economics could do what politics maybe cannot do. Maybe that Israel, for example, has an economical now relation with Morocco, and I have the suspicion that other countries will join soon, whatever their differences are in the area. Because at the end, it's like the European Union, countries that they have been killing each other for centuries. Suddenly we are sitting here as because, I have to admit, because of economy. Trade, it was coal and steel, no? That united the two first countries in this European Union. And that forced the others to join, because this was, you know, a powerful economical engine creating prosperity, and then others wanted to join this. Call me idealist, call me, you know, too optimist, but I think that we should give a chance in economics to this kind of, you know, relation that is being built up. I feel that this is a historical moment, and I don't know if the European Union is in the correct side now of this story. The lack of enthusiasm of this Parliament and the European institutions about the Abraham Accords, I have felt it in the discussions that we have had. I'm a Democrat, so, you know, many of my colleagues do not share this enthusiasm, only because maybe Israel is in this, but okay, yeah, it's confusion, you know, of things. Do you believe that maybe this could be, you know, not the answer, let's go not, but would help if we go through economy instead of going through, and instead of subventions, we filled the pockets of everybody after the Arab Spring, we went, funds, no limits. Where is all that? Isn't it better to leave it to the private sector to create prosperity in the area? It is clear that our subventions, our money, we don't know where it is, by the way, and the result is that the only last country of the Arab Spring left is Tunisia. It's a tragedy. What's going on now? Let's call it things by their name. The Arab Spring is over. What were our mistakes in this? And one of the things you cited, and I agree absolutely, is that this kind of regimes, they live out of our division. I'm a specialist in Latin America about how the Cuban intelligence has been always living for 80 years. They have been incredibly good at that, to maintain everybody divided, the opposition, so that the regime will stay. It's not the same, but the principle is that as long as the European states approach, and you said it, individually, these kind of things, we cannot also speak at the end about rule of law, about other things that the European Union wisely also adds to the economical question, compared with China and Russia, that they don't make these kind of questions. So I think that we have a moral obligation, but also a pragmatical obligation, and they are compatible. As long as we are efficient, then we could also export an agenda of rule of law that is now not accepted because our competitors, they are not for the rule of law. It's Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping. They don't have in their agenda any kind, and this is not cited by many of my colleagues in the interventions, you know, they don't have an agenda, any kind of human rights, rule of law. And I want this to be also, but let's help. How can we approach pragmatically these people in the area? Not the classical European way, ancient colonialism, you know, that we think that whatever we export is good. We have to make also understand, we have to adapt it. In Tunisia, we went with our flags. Democracy came, and then we went all to the capital. We installed offices of think tanks, NGOs, you know, it was an explosion of democracy. Where are we today? Only 10 years after. Only 10 years after. So, lessons to be learned, maybe. We have to be effective if we want to also speak about other things that I do share with Munir Satori and with many of my colleagues about the question of human rights, rule of law. Yes, the European way, but it's also the big question mark, how to do it. We have terrible competitors in the area, very attractive. They give money, it's not they give money, they construct ports, airports, palaces for the regime members, you know, you name it. I don't know if you've been in African countries, some of them, I'm not going to mention anyone, but there is usual, you know, when you visit, there is the presidential palace, which is built by the Chinese, by the way. You always find these telephone technicians, you know, working there, all Chinese. The European Union should not approach this way, of course. We all agree in this. It's not about buying presidential palaces. It's about also contributing to the prosperity and the development, you know, of these countries. And this has been, and I think it's a good obsession at how to channel this. We made mistakes, it is clear. The Arab Spring was not in Alaska, was 12 kilometers from the European borders, in my case, in my country, in Spain. The whole area. Question mark, what can we do? I'm not going to, maybe it's a too difficult question. No, I'm not going to put you the pressure. But as I told you, also I would like to hear from you if the Abraham Accords could be a tool, could be, you know, something that could help or not. That's, you know, so I'm telling you again, economics instead of politics. I'm a politician. I concede. There are maybe these kind of ways, it's an intelligent way how to approach this, because when prosperity is created and people start to see the good effects, then they want democratic immediately principles. They want liberty. As long as you have, you know, prosperity that is also shared, not by the five moguls of the, or oligarchs of the regime. So, sorry about my intervention, but, you know, maybe it's, I was also, you know, animated by your words and, you know, and some of the things that I have read, not everything, but some in your report. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I really found these comments interesting, and the importance of economics and normalization agreements. Well, what I meant when I say that the EU is maybe losing the material, you know, battle, it's perceptions. It's not what's going on really, because the relationship is still characterized by a huge degree of interdependence. Remittances, diasporas, flows of people, FDIs. The major, not maybe in all countries, but Morocco, you know, is characterized by, has been able to grow thanks to EU FDIs to a large extent. And to some extent, what you're saying about in terms of economics first, is to some extent what the joint communication argues, you know, investment in socio-economic developments with the hope that this will lead to changes in governance and in rule of law structures of the region. So I think to some extent it's a bit the rationale of the joint communication itself. When it comes to the normalization agreements, you know, I don't think that's what I said about the EU needs to be more involved in as a security provider. The EU cannot remain on the side of what's going on. The Abraham Accords is the game in town. If you don't like it, do you make sure that it is being used, because it is an opportunity in order to advance EU's interest and to advance peace in the region. There is a huge cost for conflicts in the region for the European Union. The conflict in Libya has a huge cost for the development of the region, of the development of neighboring countries, Libya, Algeria, Egypt. There is no investment plan whatsoever that can achieve the benefits of peace. So Middle East peace process, the same. We saw with the war in Ukraine that there is a cost to be paid to the European Union if the EU is not perceived as being more involved in solving the conflict. So provided that the EU uses the normalization agreements in order to make sure that it's not being done to the detriment, but indeed to the benefit of the Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation, and that it is not creating new dividing lines in the region, because that's another risk for the European Union, that new conflicts emerge based on this on this development. I'm thinking, for example, of the renewed tensions between Algeria and Morocco, and also provided that this normalization agreement trickle down, because now you still have within the Arab populations quite some skepticism and not always full endorsement of the moves from the respective governments. So that would be my take on this, and note, as you know, that the normalization agreements is being mentioned in the joint communication, but it is not mentioned in the Council conclusions that endorsed the joint communication. I think it's a mistake. I definitely think that the EU should engage further. I don't know, Katarzyna, if you want to.
Yes, I would like to. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I will answer as an economist. So, first of all, you did mention that we should try economics, not politics. In a way, that's what China is trying to do. China is trying to promote this model when you do have free trade and you have free-ish kind of market without democracy. And there's an increasing belief in the Southern Neighbourhood that maybe this is the way to go. Maybe you don't need to implement the rule of law, good governance reforms, and you still can benefit from free trade and all those reforms. There's been a study that I had the pleasure to participate in recently, and this is looking at the, there's one particular school of thought, liberal school of thought, which says that with economic integration comes peace. And indeed, that's how the EU was built, and those are the foundations of the EU. But increasingly, the understanding of the research and all the econometric analysis is that it's all good as long as you have democracy. It's a crucial component. Economy itself, economic integration itself will not promote peaceful integration unless the countries are democratic, because then the price of conflict is not high enough for the authorities in those countries. So I'm coming back again to those, investment climate things, to reliable judiciary, to corruption, which is a huge issue in the region. And actually is, when you look at the polls throughout the region, this is one of the key things that people complain about. If you have free trade, it's great, but if you still need WASTA to be able to use those free trade, you won't go, very far. So basically what I'm trying to say that, again, as an economist, I'm a huge believer in free trade and integration. But there is a limit to what economies can do without democratic reforms and without good governance and without being able to rely on the structure of the country as a business person, but also as a citizen. And I think here a good kind of example that could be brought in mind is Georgia. I spent the past 3 years almost in Georgia, and this is a country where we had huge corruption and a completely collapsed country. It's going in the wrong direction again, but there was a moment where there was this really huge movement. Georgia was on the top of, list of the countries that battled the corruption when it comes to free trade and so on. Perhaps there's a lesson learned to a certain extent to the Southern Neighbourhood countries. In particular, Lebanon could be an interesting country to look here. So I would say, again, that Abrahamic codes, we can't ignore them, whether we like it or not. But we should not let go of the kind of politics side of the things, because economics themselves will not solve the issue. Thank you.
Flexible, even if it's someone that's a specialist here in the audience would like to take a question or not. If not, we can end the meeting. Thank you, both Katarzyna and Emmanuel. I think this is a very good work that I read parts. Now I will read more. In order, we are discussing this report on Southern Neighbourhood now in our committee, as you know very well. Still, through the amendments, colleagues and I, we can refresh, and we are eager also to have up-to-date report. So this kind of study is fundamental for that. So I'm very thankful. Thank you for all of you for the help. And we have next week, it's the Shadows meeting. Tuesday. I will not forget to cite today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Good.